A bullied teen refused to cheat on a test, not realizing the teacher was secretly a talent scout for one of the most prestigious music academies in the country. 17-year-old Elijah Morgan stared down at the blank spaces on his AP Music Theory exam, his fingers trembling slightly against the cool desktop. Around him, the frantic scratching of pencils filled the classroom like restless cicadas on a summer night. He could feel the weight of 23 pairs of eyes occasionally darting in his direction, some curious, others mocking, waiting for him to crumble. The test questions blurred before him, not because they were difficult. Music theory had always come naturally to Elijah, like breathing or the way his fingers knew exactly where to land on piano keys, but because of the note that had been slipped onto his desk moments before the exam began. Answers on the back of my chair. Don't be an idiot again, piano boy. The handwriting belonged to Vance Kellerman, football captain and Elijah's primary tormentor since freshman year. Vance sat directly in front of him, occasionally leaning back so the notebook taped to his chair was visible. A gift and a threat wrapped in one. Use it, and maybe, just maybe, the daily humiliations would ease. Ignore it, and tomorrow would bring fresh hell. Miss Abernathy, the new substitute teacher, who had been filling in for the past 3 weeks, paced slowly at the front of the room. Her dark-rimmed glasses perched on her nose as she periodically glanced up from the book in her hands to survey the class. There was something different about her, an intensity that the other teachers lacked, as though she was cataloging every movement, every decision each student made. Elijah swallowed hard. His scholarship to remain at Westlake Academy depended on maintaining perfect grades. One failed test could send him back to the public school across town, away from the one place where the grand piano in the music room had become his sanctuary, away from the only thing that made him feel like more than the boy who lived in the rundown apartment with a mother working 3 jobs and a father who had disappeared into the night 7 years ago. His eyes flicked involuntarily to the answers on the back of Vance's chair. Miss Abernathy's gaze suddenly met his from across the room, her expression unreadable. Elijah looked down at his paper, shame and pride warring within him. He picked up his pencil, took a deep breath, and began to write. His own answers, pulled from countless nights studying while his mother slept exhausted on the couch. Still in her waitress uniform, each answer flowed from his understanding of chord progressions and key signatures rather than from the stolen sheet on Vance's chairback. He could almost hear his mother's voice in his head. Your integrity isn't for sale, Eli. Not for any price. When the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, Elijah handed in his test last, avoiding Vance's threatening glare. As he placed his paper on Ms. Abernathy's desk, her fingers brushed against his, a touch so brief he almost missed it. Interesting choice, Mr. Morgan, she said quietly, her eyes studying him in a way that made him feel simultaneously exposed and seen. He didn't know then that those 4 words would change the entire trajectory of his life. Cool. The hallway after class felt narrower than usual, the walls pressing in as Elijah tried to make himself invisible. A practiced art by now. He kept his head down, dark curls falling over his eyes, shoulders hunched as though preparing for impact. His worn backpack, patched in 3 places with duct tape, hung heavy with textbooks that were his tickets to possibilities beyond Millfield. Piano boy! Elijah's stomach clenched. He walked faster, the exit doors at the end of the hallway seeming to recede with each step. Vance's hand landed hard on his shoulder, spinning him around. The larger boy's face was flushed with anger, a vein pulsing at his temple. Behind him stood his usual entourage, boys whose names Elijah knew but who had never once spoken directly to him, as though his existence was beneath acknowledgement. You think you're better than us? Vance's breath smelled of mint gum, a stark contrast to the ugliness of his words. Miss Abernathy was watching. I gave you a gift and you threw it back in my face. I didn't ask for your answers, Elijah said, his voice softer than he intended. What was that? Couldn't hear you. Vance leaned in closer, towering over Elijah's slighter frame. Maybe if you weren't such a self-righteous little freak, people might actually like you. The words stung more than they should have after 3 years of similar taunts. Elijah's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on a point past Vance's shoulder. The silent treatment? Real mature. Vance knocked Elijah's backpack to the ground, sending papers scattering across the polished floor. Good luck staying at this school when you fail that test. Back to the slums for you. Laughter rippled through the group as they sauntered away, leaving Elijah kneeling on the cold floor, gathering his notes, compositions he'd been working on for months, now bearing the imprint of countless shoes. Need some help? Elijah looked up to find Miss Abernathy kneeling beside him, already collecting some of the scattered sheets. Her movements were precise, careful as she gathered his music compositions, her eyes scanning the notes on the pages with what appeared to be more than casual interest. "These are yours?" she asked, holding up a sheet where he'd been experimenting with a nocturne-inspired piece. He nodded, embarrassment burning his cheeks. "Just something I was working on." "Just something," she repeated, a strange smile playing at her lips. She handed him the stack of papers, their corners now bent and smudged. "You know, Mr. Morgan, there are moments in life that define us, choices that reveal who we truly are when everything is stripped away." Elijah met her gaze, unsure how to respond. "Your test," she continued. "You could have taken the easy way. It wouldn't have been my work." He shrugged, as though it was the simplest thing in the world, though they both knew it wasn't. Not in a school where belonging often came at the price of compromise. Ms. Abernathy tilted her head slightly. "The auditorium is free during 5th period. I notice you have a free block then." Elijah frowned, confused by the sudden change in topic. "Yes, the piano in there is a Steinway, far superior to the upright in the music room." She stood, smoothing her skirt. "Just an observation." Before he could respond, she was walking away, her heels clicking rhythmically against the floor like a metronome. The school cafeteria buzzed with the cacophony of teenage life. Laughter, arguments, and the constant ping of mobile notifications, creating a dissonant symphony that set Elijah's teeth on edge. He sat alone at the end of a table, as always, his lunch a simple peanut butter sandwich and an apple, packed carefully by his mother before she left for her morning shift at the diner. Across the room, Vance held court at the popular table, occasionally throwing glances in Elijah's direction that promised later retribution. Beside him sat Alyssa Chen, cello prodigy and the only other scholarship student Elijah knew of. Unlike him, however, Alyssa had managed to bridge the divide between her background and Westlake's elite. She wore her status like a second skin, comfortable in both worlds. Elijah had spoken to her exactly once, during freshman orientation, before he understood the unwritten rules of Westlake's social hierarchy. She had been polite but distant, and he had never tried again, accepting the invisible boundaries between them. "Is this seat taken?" The voice startled him from his thoughts. Alyssa stood at his table, lunch tray in hand, dark hair falling in a sleek curtain over one shoulder. She wore the same uniform as every other girl at Westlake, but somehow the navy blazer and plaid skirt looked like high fashion on her slender frame. Elijah glanced around, certain she must be addressing someone else. No, it's free," he finally managed, moving his backpack from the chair beside him. She sat with the grace of someone who had spent years perfecting posture, setting her tray down carefully. "You're Elijah Morgan." It wasn't a question, but he nodded anyway. "I saw what happened with Vance in the test." She kept her voice low, her eyes darting briefly to the popular table, where her absence was already causing speculation. "Not everyone here is like them, you know." Elijah took a bite of his sandwich to avoid responding immediately. The peanut butter stuck to the roof of his mouth, buying him precious seconds to compose his thoughts. "Doesn't matter," he finally said. "I'm used to it." "It does matter." Her voice took on an edge that surprised him. "And nobody should get used to being treated like that." Before he could formulate a response, she continued, "I heard you play once, last year after school. You thought the music room was empty, but I was in the practice booth." A slight blush colored her cheeks. "It was Chopin, right? The Nocturne in E-flat major?" Elijah stared at her, caught between embarrassment at being overheard and astonishment that she had recognized the piece. "Yeah, it was beautiful. You play like..." She paused, searching for the right words. "Like you're having a conversation with the composer." Something warm unfurled in Elijah's chest, an unfamiliar feeling that took him a moment to recognize as pride. "Thanks," he said softly, then ventured, "You play too?" "Ciao, cello." She nodded, a genuine smile transforming her face. "Since I was 6. My grandmother taught me before she stopped abruptly, as though catching herself revealing too much. "Anyway, there's a chamber music showcase coming up. They're looking for pianists to accompany the string sections." "I know about it," Elijah said. He'd seen the flyers but hadn't considered signing up. School showcases meant exposure, and exposure meant becoming an even bigger target. "You should audition," Alyssa said, then lowered her voice. "Miss Abernathy is one of the judges. She specifically asked if I knew you." Elijah's brow furrowed. "Why would she?" "Hey, Liz!" A voice called from across the cafeteria. We're heading to the library for study group. You coming? Alyssa gathered her things, having barely touched her lunch. Think about it, she said to Elijah. Auditions are Friday after school. She hesitated, then added, and Elijah, what you did in that test? That took courage. She walked away before he could respond, leaving him with half a sandwich and a head full of questions. The auditorium during fifth period was eerily silent, the rows of empty seats like witnesses to a private confession. Sunlight filtered through high windows, dust motes dancing in the beams that illuminated the stage where a single grand piano stood, its polished black surface gleaming like still water at midnight. Elijah approached it cautiously, as though it might disappear if he moved too quickly. His fingers tingled with anticipation as he set his backpack down and eased onto the bench, which adjusted with a soft creak beneath his weight. The keys felt cool and smooth under his fingertips as he positioned his hands, closing his eyes for a brief moment. Then he began to play. Tentatively at first, a simple scale to test the action of the keys, then with growing confidence as the rich tones filled the auditorium. He lost himself in the music, forgetting the test, forgetting Vance, forgetting the constant strain of trying to exist in a world that seemed determined to reject him. There was only the piano, his fingers, and the melodies that poured from some deep, untouched place within him. He didn't start with the compositions he'd been working on. Instead, he played from memory. Bach's Prelude in C major, letting the familiar patterns center him before transitioning into Debussy's Clair de Lune, his body swaying slightly as the dreamlike quality of the piece transported him. Time collapsed. He might have been playing for minutes or hours when a voice from the shadows jolted him back to reality. Most students your age would choose something more contemporary, more impressive. Mrs. Abernathy emerged from the wings of the stage, her footsteps silent until she stood at the curve of the piano. In the theatrical lighting, her features seemed sharper, her eyes more penetrating. Elijah's hands faltered, the final notes of Debussy hanging in the air between them. I didn't know anyone was listening. Music is always meant to be heard, Mr. Morgan, even when we think we're playing only for ourselves. She gestured to the piano. Please, don't stop on my account. Hesitantly, he positioned his hands again, uncertain what to play under such intent observation. Finally, he decided on one of his own compositions, a piece he'd been working on for months, inspired by the view from his apartment window during a thunderstorm. The melody was melancholy but resilient, building toward a resolution that felt like the sun breaking through clouds. When he finished, the last note resonated through the empty auditorium before fading into silence. He kept his eyes on the keys, afraid to look up and see judgment, or worse, pity in her expression. That's not in the standard repertoire, Miss Abernathy said after a long moment. No, he swallowed. I wrote it. Yes, I thought as much. She moved closer, studying him with an intensity that made him straighten his posture involuntarily. Tell me, Elijah, may I call you Elijah? What do you plan to do after graduation? The question caught him off guard. The future was a luxury he rarely allowed himself to consider in detail. College, if I can get a scholarship. Maybe study music education. Music education, she repeated as though testing the weight of the words. A noble pursuit. And if you could do anything, if resources were no object, what would you choose? The question opened a door in his mind that he usually kept firmly shut. I'd want to compose and perform, travel to places where music is, where it matters to people the way it matters to me. Miss Abernathy nodded, as though he had confirmed something she already knew. The showcase this Friday. Will you be participating? Elijah hesitated. I don't know. May I offer some advice? She didn't wait for his answer. Opportunities rarely announce themselves with fanfare, Elijah. More often, they slip quietly into our lives disguised as small decisions, seemingly insignificant choices. She glanced at her watch. I've taken enough of your time, but do consider the showcase. I think you might be surprised by what could happen. She turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and about your test you passed. With the highest score in the class, in fact. Relief washed over him, followed immediately by concern. Vance will... Mr. Kellerman has his own academic issues to worry about, she said, a hint of steel beneath her composed exterior. I wouldn't concern yourself with his reaction. As she walked away, Elijah felt as though something fundamental had shifted, like the first tremor before an earthquake, subtle but irrevocable. That evening, Elijah sat at the kitchen table of the small apartment he shared with his mother. Textbooks spread around him as he tried to focus on calculus problems instead of the conversation with Ms. Abernathy. Outside, rain tapped against the windows in an erratic rhythm, and somewhere in the building, a baby was crying. The door opened with a rush of damp air as his mother entered, her hair frizzy from the rain, exhaustion etched in the lines around her eyes. Eleanor Morgan had once been a dancer, graceful and vibrant, before life and responsibility had gradually bent her into someone who moved through the world with efficient purpose rather than joy. "You're home early," Elijah said, rising to take her rain-soaked jacket. Dinah was slow because of the weather. She offered him a tired smile, running a hand through his curls affectionately. "They let some of us go early." How was school? It was their nightly ritual, this exchange of mundane details that created the framework of their relationship. Usually, Elijah kept his answers brief and positive, protecting her from the daily indignities he endured. But tonight, something compelled him toward honesty. "There's a showcase on Friday. For musicians." He focused on arranging her jacket on the hook by the door. "One of the teachers thinks I should participate." Elena paused in the act of removing her work shoes, interest brightening her weary features. "A music showcase? Eli, that's wonderful. Of course you should do it." He shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable with her enthusiasm. "It's not a big deal, probably just a school thing." "Everything starts as just a school thing," she said, patting in stocking feet to the refrigerator. "Remember how your father's band started in a garage?" The mention of his father hung awkwardly between them. James Morgan had been a talented musician, a guitarist whose ambitions had always exceeded his achievements and whose departure had left a silence in their lives that neither of them knew how to fill. "This is different," Elijah said quietly. Elena turned from the refrigerator, a container of leftovers in hand. Her eyes, the same deep brown as Elijah's, held a familiar mixture of sadness and fierce determination. "You're right. It is different, because you have something he never did." "Microom, what's that?" "Follow through." She set the container in the microwave. "Talent is common, Eli. Perseverance isn't." She pressed the start button, and the microwave hummed to life. "So this teacher, they specifically suggested you participate?" "Mrs. Abernathy. She's a substitute, only been here a few weeks." Elijah closed his calculus book, giving up the pretense of studying. "There's something different about her, like she sees things other people don't." "She sees you," Elena said simply. "That's rarer than it should be." The microwave beeped, and she retrieved her dinner. Leftover pasta that Elijah had made the night before. She sat across from him at the small table, twirling noodles around her fork. "What would you play if you did the showcase?" Elijah hesitated. "Maybe one of my compositions? I've been working on something new." Elena's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Your own music? You'd perform that publicly?" He'd never shared his compositions with anyone before, not even his mother, though she knew he wrote music. It had always felt too personal, too revealing. "I'm thinking about it." "Oh, Eli." Her voice softened, and he saw in her eyes not the exhausted single mother who worked endless shifts, but the woman who had once danced across stages with dreams as vast as the sky. "Your music is who you are. Sharing it, that takes a special kind of courage." "Or stupidity," he muttered, thinking of Vance and his friends. The ridicule that would surely follow. "Those boys," Elena said, reading his thoughts with the uncanny perception of a mother who had witnessed too many unexplained bruises and torn notebooks. "They don't determine your worth. They kind of do at Westlake. Then maybe it's time to show them, and yourself, that there's a world beyond Westlake. A world where what you can create matters more than who your parents are or how much money you have." She reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "Friday night?" He nodded. "I'll switch shifts with Darlene. Nothing could keep me from watching you play." Later, as Elijah lay in bed listening to the rain, he thought about Ms. Abernathy's words, "Opportunities rarely announce themselves with fanfare." He pulled out his phone and texted Alyssa Chen a message that felt like stepping off a cliff. "About the showcase. Is the offer to collaborate still open?" Her response came almost immediately. "Yes. Meet me in the practice room tomorrow at lunch. Bring your music." He fell asleep with the ghost of his own melody playing in his mind, and for once the thought of tomorrow didn't fill him with dread. The next morning, Westlake Academy hummed with pre-weekend energy. Students moved through the hallways with the barely contained exuberance of captives eyeing freedom, weekend plans exchanged in excited whispers between classes. Elijah felt none of it. His mind was too full of music, of the compositions he'd stayed up refining until past midnight, of the upcoming meeting with Alyssa. He moved through the corridors in his usual defensive posture, eyes down, body angled to slip between groups without drawing attention. His strategy failed in the science wing, where Vance and two of his friends emerged from the chemistry lab just as Elijah passed. The collision was probably intentional, Vance's shoulder connecting hard with Elijah's, sending him stumbling into the wall. "Watch where you're going, piano boy," Vance sneered. "Or are you too busy thinking about how you screwed me over on Abernathy's test?" Elijah steadied himself, adjusting his backpack. "I didn't screw anyone over. I just did my own work." "Yeah, and made the rest of us look bad." One of Vance's friends, Tyler, Elijah thought his name was, chimed in. "Abernathy's on a rampage about academic integrity now. She's making half the class retake the test." Elijah hadn't known that. Guilt and a strange sense of vindication battled briefly before he pushed both aside. "That's not my problem." He tried to step around them, but Vance moved to block his path. "Actually, I think it is your problem. You see, I have a game on Saturday. Coach says if I don't maintain a C average, I'm benched." His voice dropped lower, menacing. "And if I'm benched, piano boy, I'm going to have a lot of free time to make your life hell." The threat hung in the air between them, familiar in its cruelty. Elijah had heard variations of it for years, from Vance, from others before him, from a world that seemed determined to punish him for the crime of being different. What was unfamiliar was the response that rose within him, not fear, not resignation, but a calm, clear anger. "I think," Elijah said, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice, "that you're going to fail or pass based on what you know, just like everyone else." He met Vance's eyes directly. "And I think you know that." Vance's face flushed red, his hand curling into a fist at his side. For a moment, Elijah was certain he was about to be hit, right there in the hallway, regardless of consequences. "Is there a problem, gentlemen?" Ms. Abernathy's voice cut through the tension like a blade. She stood several feet away, her posture deceptively casual, but there was nothing casual about the sharp assessment in her gaze as it moved from Vance's fist to Elijah's face. "No problem, Missy. Abernathy," Vance said, his voice suddenly pitched higher, his fist uncurling. "Just discussing the test." "I see." She didn't sound convinced. "In that case, perhaps you'd like to discuss it further in my classroom after school. I'll be offering review sessions for those who need to retake the exam. I have practice." "I'm sure Coach Stevens would agree that your academic standing takes priority," she interrupted smoothly. 4 o'clock, mister. "Kern Journey Kellerman." "Don't be late." She turned to Elijah. "Mr. Morgan, I believe you have somewhere to be." Relief and something like respect washed over him. "Yes. Thank you, Mrs. Abernathy." As he walked away, he could feel Vance's glare burning into his back, but for once, it didn't touch him. He was already thinking of music again, of the meeting with Alyssa, of possibilities that suddenly seemed within reach. The practice room was the smallest in the music department, barely large enough for a baby grand piano and a few chairs. What it lacked in size, however, it made up for in acoustics. Sound bounced off the wood-paneled walls and high ceiling, creating a rich resonance that made even scales sound somehow more profound. Alyssa was already there when Elijah arrived, her cello case open on the floor beside her as she rosined her bow with practice strokes. She looked up when he entered, a smile lighting her features. "You came," she said, and he was surprised to hear relief in her voice, as though she had doubted he would show. "I said I would." He set his backpack down and pulled out several sheets of music, creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. "I brought a few pieces. I wasn't sure what would work with cello." Alyssa set her bow aside and reached for the music, her fingers careful as she smoothed the pages. Her eyes moved rapidly across the notes, and he watched her expression change from curiosity to something like wonder. "You wrote these?" she asked softly. He nodded, suddenly self-conscious. Having someone else see his compositions felt like standing naked in a crowded room, a vulnerability he wasn't prepared for. "They're beautiful, Elijah." She looked up at him with newfound respect. "Really beautiful. This one?" She held up a piece he had titled simply, "After Rain." "I think this would be perfect for the showcase. The cello part practically writes itself." She moved to her instrument, positioning it between her knees with the easy familiarity of someone handling an extension of themselves. "May I?" "You want to try it now?" he asked, surprised. "Why not? We only have lunch period." She gestured to the piano. "I'll follow your lead." Hesitantly, Elijah sat at the piano, positioning the music where he could see it, though he knew the piece by heart. He began to play, the melody tentative at first, like the first drops of rain after drought. Alyssa listened for several measures, her head tilted slightly, eyes closed as she absorbed the structure of the piece. Then, without warning, she joined in, the cello's voice rising to meet the piano's, deeper and richer, adding layers of emotion that Elijah had felt but hadn't known how to express. They played through the piece once, Alyssa improvising her part with intuitive understanding of where the music wanted to go. When they finished, the final notes seemed to hang in the air between them, a bridge newly built. That was... Elijah struggled to find words. I know. Alyssa's eyes were bright with excitement. It's like it was meant to be a duet all along. You just didn't know it yet. Something warm expanded in Elijah's chest. Not just pride, but a sense of connection that had been absent for so long, he'd almost forgotten its feel. We'd need to formalize your part. Write it down properly. We have 2 days, she said, reaching for a pencil in her bag. Let's get to work. They spent the rest of the lunch period bent over the music, Alyssa suggesting modifications, Elijah adjusting harmonies to better support the cello's voice. They worked with the focused intensity of much older musicians, hardly speaking except to discuss the music, occasionally playing short sections to test their changes. When the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, they both looked up in surprise as though waking from a shared dream. Same time tomorrow? Alyssa asked, carefully packing her cello. Same time, Elijah agreed, gathering his music. He hesitated, then added, thank you. Farina Mama for this. She paused, her hand stilling on the clasp of her case. I should be thanking you. Do you know how rare it is to find someone our age who understands music like you do? Who feels it? She shook her head slightly. Don't let them convince you that you don't belong here, Elijah. You belong in this world more than most of them ever will. As they left the practice room together, Elijah noticed something he hadn't before. The curious glances from other students, the whispers that followed them down the hallway. For once, though, he didn't shrink from the attention. Something had shifted, a new confidence taking root that had nothing to do with what others thought of him and everything to do with what he now knew about himself. The day of the showcase arrived with unexpected speed. Elijah woke before his alarm, his body humming with a nervous energy that sent him pacing the small confines of his bedroom before dawn had fully broken. He dressed with unusual care, the pressed white shirt his mother had ironed the night before, the navy blue slacks that were slightly too short at the ankles, but were the best they had. His fingers combed through his unruly curls in a futile attempt at neatness before he gave up, accepting that his hair, like his music, would follow its own rules. Elena was already in the kitchen when he emerged, making pancakes despite the early hour. She turned when she heard him, her face lighting up with a pride that made his throat tight. My handsome musician, she said, flipping a pancake with a practiced flick of her wrist. Ready for your big day? It's just a school showcase, Mom, he reminded her, though they both knew it wasn't. Not anymore. She hummed, unconvinced. Eat your breakfast. Artists need fuel. They ate together in companionable silence, the weight of expectation hanging between them, unspoken but palpable. When Elijah finally rose to leave, Elena caught his hand. Whatever happens tonight, she said softly, I am already so proud of you. Not just for your music, but for who you are. The choices you make. The heart you have. She squeezed his fingers. Your father missed out on knowing the extraordinary person you've become. Elijah swallowed hard against the sudden lump in his throat. Thanks, Mom. I'll see you tonight. The school day passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. Elijah and Alyssa met during lunch for one final rehearsal, both of them too keyed up to eat. Their performance had evolved over the past 2 days into something neither of them had anticipated. A piece that told a story of isolation, broken by unexpected connection, of two voices finding harmony together. Miss Abernathy had stopped by during their practice the day before, listening silently from the doorway before commenting, You've tapped into something authentic here. Hold on to that feeling tonight. As the final bell rang, releasing students into the weekend, Elijah made his way to the auditorium for sound check. The space, so familiar from his solitary practice sessions, had been transformed. Stage lights illuminated the grand piano at center stage, now joined by a single chair for Alyssa. Programs had been stacked neatly on a table by the entrance, and tech students were adjusting microphones and checking sound levels. Nervous? Alyssa appeared beside him, cello case in hand, her usual school uniform replaced by a simple black dress that made her look older, more sophisticated. Terrified, Elijah admitted. You always, she smiled, but it's a good terrified, like standing at the edge of something wonderful and scary at the same time. They weren't scheduled to perform until near the end of the showcase, a placement that Ms. Abernathy had arranged, though she hadn't explained why. As they waited backstage listening to other students perform pieces by Bach and Beethoven, and in one case, a jazz arrangement of a pop song, Elijah felt a curious calm descend. This moment, standing in the wings with his music clutched in his hands, Alyssa beside him, his mother somewhere in the audience, felt right in a way few things in his life ever had. Whatever happened next, he had already crossed a threshold. He had chosen to be seen, to be heard. "Morgan and Chen, you're up next," the stage manager whispered. "Places, please." They walked onto the stage together, into the warm glow of the stage lights. The audience was a dark mass beyond the footlights, faces indistinguishable, but Elijah imagined his mother there, watching with those eyes that had always seen the best in him. Alyssa settled into her chair, positioning her cello, while Elijah sat at the piano, adjusting the bench to the right height. Their eyes met in a moment of silent communication, and then Elijah began to play. The piece opened softly, tentatively, like the first light of dawn touching the horizon. The piano established the melody, a solitary voice reaching outward. When Alyssa's cello joined, it was like a response from the darkness, another soul recognizing itself in the first. The two instruments conversed, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in counterpoint, building toward a climax that felt like revelation, the musical equivalent of sunlight breaking through clouds after a long storm. Elijah lost himself in the music, forgetting the audience, forgetting his nervousness, even forgetting the years of isolation that had led to this moment. There was only the piano beneath his fingers, Alyssa's cello weaving around his melody, and the pure expression of something that had lived inside him for so long without a voice. When they reached the final notes, a delicate resolution that felt both complete and like the beginning of something new, silence fell over the auditorium. For a terrible moment, Elijah thought they had failed, that the audience had been unmoved by what had felt so profound to him. Then the applause began, scattered at first, then swelling to fill the space. Elijah and Alyssa rose, her hand finding his as they took their bow together. In the front row, he could now make out his mother, on her feet, tears streaming unashamedly down her face as she clapped. And beside her, looking not at all surprised by the response, sat Ms. Abernathy, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. The backstage area buzzed with post-performance energy, students congratulating each other, parents navigating the narrow space with bouquets of flowers and proud embraces. Elijah stood slightly apart, still processing what had happened on stage. Not just the performance itself, but the connection he had felt, the sense of having finally found his voice. "Elijah!" His mother's voice cut through the chatter as she made her way toward him, arms outstretched. She enveloped him in a fierce hug that smelled of the perfume she saved for special occasions. "That was... oh, honey, I don't even have words." He hugged her back, surprised to find himself blinking back tears. "You liked it." "Liked it?" She pulled back to look at him, her eyes shining. "It was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Your father would have..." She stopped herself, then continued more firmly. "No, this is about you. Your gift, not his shadow." Before Elijah could respond, Miss Abernathy appeared beside them, accompanied by a tall man in a well-tailored suit whom Elijah didn't recognize. "Mrs. Morgan," Ms. Abernathy said, extending her hand. "A pleasure to meet you. Your son has extraordinary talent." "Thank you," Elena said, shaking her hand. "We're so grateful for your encouragement. He's mentioned how supportive you've been." Miss Abernathy smiled, then turned to the man beside her. "Allow me to introduce Robert Harlow, Dean of Admissions at the Mercer Conservatory of Music." Elijah's breath caught. The Mercer Conservatory was one of the most prestigious music schools in the country, a place he had never allowed himself to dream of attending. "Mr. Morgan," Dean Harlow said, extending his hand. His grip was firm, his gaze direct. "That was an impressive performance. Even more impressive knowing you composed the piece yourself." "Thank you, sir," Elijah managed, his mind racing to understand what was happening. "Miss Caldwell," the dean gestured to Miss Abernathy, has told me about your work. Your resilience, your integrity." Elijah blinked, confusion momentarily overriding his awe. "Mizzy Caldwell?" Miss Abernathy, or Ms. Caldwell, smiled slightly. "Rebecca Caldwell. I apologize for the subterfuge, Elijah. I'm not actually a substitute teacher. I'm the chair of the piano department at Mercer." The revelation landed like a thunderclap. Elijah looked between her and Dean Harlow, understanding slowly dawning. "You were scouting. We prefer to observe students in their natural environment. Dean Harlow explained. See how they perform under normal circumstances, not just in high-pressure audition situations. Rebecca has been visiting schools across the state, looking for exceptional talent that might otherwise go unnoticed. And she found you, Elena said softly, her hand gripping Elijah's arm tightly. Indeed she did, the dean confirmed. Mr. Morgan, we would like to offer you a full scholarship to the Mercer Conservatory beginning next fall. The scholarship covers tuition, room and board, and includes a stipend for personal expenses. The words seemed to hover in the air, too extraordinary to be immediately absorbed. Elijah felt lightheaded, as though the ground beneath him had suddenly disappeared. A full scholarship? Elena repeated, her voice thin with disbelief. To Mercer, your son has a rare gift. Miss Caldwell said, not just technical skill, but emotional intelligence in his compositions. And beyond that, her eyes met Elijah's directly. He has character, integrity. We observed his refusal to cheat despite considerable pressure. That matters to us as much as his musical ability. I don't know what to say, Elijah finally managed. Say yes, came Alyssa's voice from behind him. She had joined them unnoticed, still holding her cello. Say yes, you idiot! A laugh burst from him, half joy, half shock. Yes, of course, yes. Thank you. Dean Harlow smiled, reaching into his jacket to withdraw an envelope. Here's the formal offer letter, along with information about the conservatory. We'll need your official acceptance by June 1st, though I'm pleased to have your verbal confirmation now. Elena took the envelope with trembling hands. I can't even begin to thank you. No thanks necessary, Mrs. Morgan. This is an investment in extraordinary talent. The dean checked his watch. I'm afraid I have another engagement this evening. But Mrs. Caldwell will remain to answer any questions you might have. He shook Elijah's hand again. We look forward to welcoming you to Mercer, Mr. Morgan. As Dean Harlow moved away, Ms. Caldwell turned to Alyssa. Messinas. Chen, your performance was exceptional as well. I understand you're already committed to Juilliard next year? Alyssa nodded, a pleased flush coloring her cheeks. Yes, ma'am. They're fortunate to have you. Ms. Caldwell's gaze moved between the two students. Perhaps we'll see a formal collaboration between you two in the future. Your musical chemistry is quite remarkable. Speaking of the future, Elena said, her voice steadier now. How long will you remain at Westlake, Mrs. Caldwell? Will you continue teaching Elijah's class? My assignment here is complete, Mrs. Caldwell replied. I'll be returning to Mercer on Monday. The school will bring in an actual substitute until they can hire someone permanent. Elijah felt a pang of disappointment, realizing he wouldn't have the chance to learn more from her directly, at least not until he started at Mercer. However, Ms. Caldwell continued, I'd like to offer you both something before I go. She reached into her bag and pulled out 2 tickets. The Mercer Chamber Orchestra is performing next weekend. These are VIP tickets that include a backstage tour and a meeting with some of our current students. I thought it might give you a taste of what's to come, Elijah. And Alyssa, perhaps offer some inspiration for your studies at Juilliard. They accepted the tickets with thanks, and as the conversation continued, details about Mercer, questions about the scholarship, expressions of gratitude, Elijah found himself slightly removed from it all, observing this moment that had so suddenly, so completely changed the trajectory of his life. A week ago, he had been the bullied scholarship kid with secret compositions and a future circumscribed by limited resources. Now he stood backstage at his school's music showcase, holding a ticket to a future he had barely allowed himself to imagine. And it had all begun with a single choice: the decision to refuse Vance's answers, to maintain his integrity even when it seemed that no one was watching. Except someone had been watching. Someone who saw value in not just his talent, but in who he was. As if summoned by his thoughts, Vance appeared at the edge of the backstage area, his expression uncharacteristically uncertain. He hovered there for a moment, clearly debating whether to approach, before finally making his way toward the group. Morgan, he said, his voice lacking its usual aggression. That was pretty amazing out there. Elijah's surprise must have shown on his face because Vance continued almost defensively. What? I can appreciate good music. Thanks, Elijah said simply, unsure what else to add. An awkward silence fell, broken when Vance cleared his throat. Anyway, I heard some of what's happening. The scholarship and everything. It's cool. You deserve it. The admission seemed to cost him something. A crack in the facade he had maintained for years. Elijah realized with sudden clarity that Vance, for all his bluster and cruelty, was just another teenager navigating his own insecurities, his own pressures. "I appreciate that," Elijah said, meaning it. Vance nodded once, his gaze sliding to Ms. Caldwell. "Mary Abernathy, or whatever your name is, I passed the retest. Just so you know." A slight smile touched her lips. "I'm glad to hear it, Mr. Kellerman, Kid Kellerman. Perhaps this experience has taught us all something valuable." "Yeah, maybe." Vance shrugged, then turned back to Elijah. "Good luck at Mercer. Show them what Westlake students can do, yeah?" He walked away before Elijah could respond, disappearing into the crowd of students and parents. Elijah watched him go, feeling a strange sense of closure. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that the path that had led him here, painful as it had often been, had shaped him in necessary ways. "Well," Elena said, slipping her arm through Elijah's, "I think this calls for a celebration." "Dinner? My treat. You should join us," Alyssa said to Ms. Caldwell. "If you don't have other plans." Ms. Caldwell seemed to consider this, then nodded. "I'd be delighted. It's not often I get to witness the beginning of what I suspect will be a remarkable journey." As they left the auditorium together, Elijah's mother, his new friend, and the teacher who had seen possibilities in him that he had barely recognized in himself, Elijah felt a sense of rightness settle over him. The future stretched before him, full of music and possibility, a path illuminated by a single act of integrity that had opened doors he never knew existed. Outside, the evening air was cool against his face, stars just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear music, perhaps from a passing car, perhaps from within himself. The melody was new, untested, full of promise. He would begin composing it tomorrow.